Welcome, gentle listeners, to another journey through the quiet corridors of history. Tonight, we're traveling far back to ancient Greece, where the marble columns stood gleaming white against azure skies, and where life, though beautiful in many ways, could end in the most extraordinary and unfortunate circumstances. I know what you might be thinking. A story about terrible deaths doesn't sound particularly restful. But there's something oddly comforting about exploring these distant shadows from the safety of your warm bed, knowing that these ancient struggles are long past, like examining old photographs in a dusty album, historical curiosities that can no longer touch us. So settle in, pull your covers a little closer, and let your breathing slow as we drift back 25 centuries to a world where olive groves rustled in Mediterranean breezes, where the scent of burning incense mixed with salt air from nearby harbors, and where death, though often harsh, was met with a stoicism and acceptance that we might find surprisingly peaceful. If you're new here, welcome to this quiet corner of history. And if you've been with me before, thank you for returning to this gentle space where learning and rest intertwine like morning mist over ancient ruins. Feel free to close your eyes, let your mind wander, and if this brings you comfort, perhaps share it with someone else who might need a moment of peaceful escape. The ancient Greeks had a word, thanatos, meaning death. They personified it as a gentle figure, a winged youth who brought not terror, but rest. Tonight, we'll explore how this rest came to those who lived in that distant world, sometimes in ways that seem harsh to us, but which they accepted as part of the natural order, like the changing of seasons or the rise and fall of tides. So breathe deeply, and let's begin our journey to ancient Greece, where the stories we'll share are finished, the struggles long over, and the only thing left is the gentle rhythm of history washing over us like waves on a distant shore. Our first stop takes us to Athens in the year 399 BCE, to a small, dim prison cell where one of history's greatest philosophers sits calmly, waiting for sunset. The walls are rough stone, cool to the touch, and through a small barred window, golden afternoon light filters in, carrying with it the distant sounds of the agora, merchants calling their wares, children playing in narrow streets, life continuing its eternal rhythm. Socrates, now 70 years old, sits with remarkable composure for a man who will die before the sun sets. His friends surround him, some weeping, others arguing that he should flee the city, escape this unjust sentence. But the old philosopher simply smiles. That same patient smile he wore when questioning young aristocrats about virtue and wisdom, when challenging the assumptions of generals and poets alike. The charges against him seem almost quaint to us now, corrupting the youth, introducing new gods, impiety against the state religion. But in Athens, where democracy was still a fragile experiment, where the memory of tyrants and foreign invasions cast long shadows, these charges carried the weight of treason. The jury of 500 citizens had voted, and by a margin that surprised even his accusers, they chose death. Hemlock, Conium maculatum, grew wild throughout Greece, a tall plant with delicate white flowers that looked almost innocent, swaying in summer breezes. The Greeks knew its properties well. How, when properly prepared, it brought not the violent convulsions of other poisons, but a gentle, progressive paralysis, like slowly sinking into a warm bath, awareness fading peacefully as the body simply stopped. As the sun begins to touch the horizon, the prison attendant arrives, carrying a simple clay cup. The man seems nervous, apologetic, clearly affected by the dignity of his condemned prisoner. Socrates takes the cup without hesitation, examines it with the same curiosity he might show for a geometric proof or a question of ethics. The liquid inside is pale green, unremarkable, carrying perhaps a slight bitter scent that mingles with the oil from the small lamp flickering in the corner. "Tell me," Socrates asks the attendant with genuine interest, "how should this be done?" Ever the student, even now, ever curious about proper procedure, about doing things correctly and with dignity. The man explains, drink it all, then walk around until your legs feel heavy, then lie down and let the poison do its work. And so, with his friends gathered close, some still weeping quietly, others taking notes to preserve this moment for posterity, Socrates drinks. He drains the cup completely, sets it down with a steady hand, and begins to pace the small cell. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. His sandals soft against the worn stone floor, his breathing calm and measured. Within minutes, he feels a tingling in his feet, a strange coolness creeping up his ankles. It's beginning, he says simply, and lies down on the narrow wooden bed. His friends lean closer, straining to hear his words, but his voice remains clear, thoughtful, as if he were simply making an observation about the weather or commenting on a point of philosophy. The hemlock works its way slowly upward, numbing first his toes, then his feet, climbing like cool water filling a vessel. He can still feel the rough wool of his tunic against his chest, still hear the evening sounds of Athens beyond the prison walls, still see the faces of his friends in the lamplight, but gradually, peacefully, these sensations begin to fade. Remember, he tells them, his voice growing softer now, we owe a rooster to Asclepius, referring to the god of healing, the traditional offering made when recovering from illness. Some scholars believe he meant that death itself was a kind of healing, a release from the illness of mortal life, a final cure for all earthly suffering. His breathing slows, becomes shallow but remains peaceful. No gasping, no struggle, just a gentle ebbing like a tide slowly receding from a quiet beach. His eyes remain open, fixed on something his friends cannot see. And then, with the last light of day fading from the prison window, the great philosopher simply stops. The attendant checks for a pulse, finds none, and gently closes those famous eyes that had spent 7 decades observing the world, questioning everything, searching for truth and wisdom. Death by hemlock, the Athenians had concluded, was both humane and fitting for a citizen, allowing even the condemned to die with dignity, to maintain their composure, to speak final words of wisdom or comfort. If you're still listening, still drifting along with these ancient stories, feel free to let your own breathing slow and deepen, like Socrates in his final moments, peaceful and unafraid. And if this gentle journey through history is bringing you comfort, perhaps share it with someone who might also find rest in these distant tales. Now let us drift, like smoke from an altar fire, from Athens to Sicily, to the prosperous Greek colony of Acragas, where tyrants ruled with both magnificence and cruelty. The year might be around 570 BCE, though time moves strangely in these ancient stories, blending like watercolors in the Mediterranean sun. Here, in his palace overlooking the Azure Sea, lived Phalaris, a tyrant whose name still whispers through history like wind through olive branches. Tyrant, in the ancient Greek sense, meant simply one who had seized power outside traditional means, not necessarily evil, though Phalaris would earn that darker meaning through his innovations in cruelty. The palace courtyard would have been beautiful, marble columns casting cool shadows over mosaic floors, fountains splashing softly in the afternoon heat, the scent of jasmine and rose mixing with salt air from the harbor below. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, their sandals whispering against polished stone, carrying silver platters of figs and honeyed wine, tending to the luxuries that wealth and power could provide. It was here that Perilaus, a skilled metalworker from Athens, came seeking patronage. He had traveled far across the wine-dark sea that Homer sang about, carrying with him plans for something unprecedented, something that would, he believed, secure his fortune and his reputation. What he proposed to Phalaris was both a work of art and an instrument of execution, fused together in bronze and fire. Picture, if you will, a bull crafted from bronze, life-sized, beautiful in its proportions, with careful attention paid to every muscle, every fold of skin, every detail that would make it seem almost alive in the flickering light of torches. The bronze would gleam golden in sunlight, warm to the touch, magnificent enough to adorn any palace courtyard, a testament to Greek artistry and skill. But this bull held a secret, a hollow interior accessible through a door hidden in its side, large enough for a human being to enter, though they would not do so willingly. Inside, the bronze surfaces would be smooth, polished, with no handholds, no way to brace oneself, nothing but curved metal walls that would soon grow impossibly hot. The genius, if we can call such cruelty genius, lay in the acoustics. Perillaios had designed a system of pipes and chambers within the bull's head so that the screams of anyone trapped inside would be transformed, their anguish converted into sounds resembling the lowing of an actual bull, their final words becoming something almost musical, haunting, beautiful in its way. Valaris listened to this proposal, examined the bronze bull, ran his hands over its smooth flanks, considered the innovation being offered to him. And then, with the practical wisdom that often accompanies absolute power, he made a decision that Perillaios had not anticipated. "This is indeed magnificent," the tyrant said, his voice carrying the authority of one accustomed to being obeyed. "But surely the inventor should be the first to test his creation, to ensure it works as promised, to demonstrate its effectiveness." The palace guards, bronze themselves in their armor, moved silently to surround the metalworker. Perillaios, perhaps only now understanding the true horror of what he had created, began to protest, to explain that this was merely a demonstration, that he never intended, but his words were lost as strong hands seized him, dragged him toward the bronze bull, toward the door that opened like a mouth waiting to swallow him. Inside the bull, the bronze walls would have felt cool at first, smooth and oddly comforting, like being enclosed in a bronze egg. But outside, palace servants were already building the fire, arranging logs and kindling beneath the bull's belly, preparing to transform this beautiful artwork into something else entirely. The first flames would have cast dancing shadows on the courtyard walls, their light playing across the faces of palace courtiers who had gathered to witness this inaugural performance. The fire grew, fed by dry olive wood that burned hot and steady, the kind of fire that bronze workers knew well, the kind that could make metal malleable, workable, or in this case, unbearably hot. As the bronze began to warm, Perillaios would have felt the change gradually, the walls around him growing from cool to warm to uncomfortably hot, like being inside an oven that was slowly heating. The air itself began to shimmer with heat, became difficult to breathe, thick and scorching as it filled his lungs. His hands, pressed against the bronze walls, would have felt the metal growing hotter and hotter until touching it became impossible, until the very air around him seemed to burn. And when he finally began to scream, when the pain became too much to bear silently, his voice traveled through those carefully designed pipes, transformed by Perillaios' own engineering into the deep, haunting lowing of a bull. From outside, to those watching in the courtyard, it would have sounded almost peaceful, like cattle calling across a summer meadow, like the gentle sounds of rural life that might lull one to sleep. The terrible irony was not lost on Valaris, that beauty and horror could be so intimately connected that the most refined artistry could serve the most brutal purposes. The fire burned for hours, its light gradually fading as the sun set over Sicily, as the sounds from within the bull grew softer, then ceased altogether. When finally the bronze had cooled, when servants could safely open the hidden door, they found what remained of Perillaios, transformed by his own invention into something barely recognizable as human. Valaris, it is said, used his bronze bull many times over the years of his rule, each time marveling at the way screams became music, the way suffering could be transformed into something that sounded almost beautiful. But tyranny, even in ancient Greece, could not last forever. When revolution finally came to Akragas, when the people rose up against their oppressor, they chose a fitting end for Phalaris himself. The bronze bull, still beautiful in its craftsmanship, still gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, received its creator, its patron, its final victim. As the flames rose beneath its bronze belly for the last time, as Phalaris discovered firsthand what his many victims had experienced, the bull's voice sang once more, a funeral song for tyranny itself, a final, ironic symphony of justice. Let your breathing grow calm, like evening settling over that ancient courtyard, like the peaceful silence that follows the end of such dark stories. These events, terrible as they seem, are finished now, their echoes fading into history like the last notes of an ancient song. Drift now across the Aegean Sea, where Greek triremes once cut through wine-dark waves, their bronze rams gleaming, their sails full of Mediterranean wind. We travel not just through space, but through the complex relationships between cultures, to a method of execution that the Greeks learned about and recorded and remembered, though it was not their own invention. The Persians, those ancient enemies and occasional allies of the Greek city-states, had developed what they called scaphism, from the Greek word scaphi, meaning anything hollowed out, like a boat or a trough, or in this case, a human-sized wooden container that would become both prison and tomb. Picture, if you will, the Persian court in its magnificence, gardens where peacocks wandered between fountains, courtyards cooled by ingenious systems of channels and shade, the scent of rosewater and saffron drifting on warm breezes. Here, justice was administered with the same attention to detail that governed palace architecture, with the same patient craftsmanship that created intricate carpets, with the same deliberate care that arranged court ceremonies. When someone committed a crime serious enough to warrant the ultimate punishment, but where the Persian desire for prolonged suffering required more than a simple execution, scaphism was prepared like an elaborate meal, with careful attention to each component, each stage of the process, each detail that would ensure the condemned experienced every possible moment of their fate. 2 boats, or boat-shaped wooden troughs, were prepared, each carved to accommodate a human form, each designed to fit together like pieces of an elaborate puzzle. The wood would be smooth, carefully sanded, perhaps cedar or oak, materials chosen for their durability, their resistance to rot and weathering, their ability to maintain their shape through what was to come. The condemned person would be placed in the lower boat, positioned carefully so that their head, hands and feet protruded through specially cut holes, while their torso remained protected inside the wooden shell. Then the upper boat would be fitted over them, creating a sealed chamber with only their extremities exposed to air, to light, to the attention of their executioners. But this was only the beginning, the first movement in a symphony of suffering that could last for weeks. The Persians, with characteristic thoroughness, had learned that the human body could endure far more than most people imagined, that death could be delayed, prolonged, stretched like a piece of bronze beaten thin by a master metalworker. The exposed face would be smeared with honey, rich golden honey that bees had made from the nectar of Persian roses, honey that attracted every flying creature in the vicinity. The hands and feet, similarly treated, became beacons for insects, targets for every wasp, bee, fly and ant within miles of the execution site. Inside the wooden boats, the body would be force-fed milk and honey, nourishing foods that would keep the condemned person alive, but which would also begin the process of internal decay. The human digestive system, forced to process these rich substances without the ability to eliminate waste properly, would begin to rebel, to create conditions that would attract even more insects, more vermin, more creatures drawn to the scent of human distress. Days would pass, each one bringing new torments, new invasions of the wooden prison. Maggots would begin to appear, drawn by the accumulating waste, by the sweet scent of honey mixed with human decay. They would burrow into living flesh, creating their own colonies, their own cities beneath the skin, their own bustling communities fed by their unwilling host. The condemned person would remain conscious through much of this, aware of every sensation, every new inhabitant of their body, every fresh wave of pain and revulsion. They could still speak, still beg, still pray to whatever gods they believed in, though their words would become increasingly difficult to understand as swelling and infection progressed. Greek historians, particularly Plutarch, recorded these details with the same meticulous care they brought to describing battles or political negotiations. They understood that scaphism represented something beyond mere execution. It was a statement about power, about the patience of authority, about the ability of human ingenuity to create suffering so prolonged and intimate that it transcended simple death and became something closer to a form of art. The psychological torture may have been worse than the physical suffering, knowing that death would come, but not knowing when, trapped in darkness save for the narrow circles of light around face, hands, and feet, aware that each day brought fresh horrors, fresh invasions of the body, fresh reasons to long for the release that seemed always just out of reach. Some lasted 2 or 3 weeks, their bodies somehow finding the strength to continue functioning, even as they became hosts to entire ecosystems of parasites and scavengers. Others, perhaps more fortunate, succumbed within days, their hearts simply stopping from shock, from infection, from the sheer accumulated weight of suffering that flesh could no longer bear. The Greeks, observing these Persian practices, recording them for posterity, seemed both horrified and fascinated. Here was execution raised to the level of performance art. Death transformed into something so elaborate, so time-consuming, so thoroughly considered that it challenged their own concepts of justice and punishment. Rest now, let these ancient horrors fade like shadows at dawn, like memories of bad dreams that lose their power in morning light. These stories, difficult as they are, remind us of the precious nature of peace, of the comfort found in gentle endings, in the simple blessing of falling asleep naturally, safely, in our own beds. And if you're finding comfort in these distant tales, in this exploration of how others face their darkest moments, perhaps share this quiet space with someone who might also find peace in these ancient stories, someone who might appreciate this gentle journey through history's shadows. Let us drift now, like evening mist rising from the valleys between Spartan hills, to a place where childhood ended abruptly, where the concept of mercy was considered a weakness, where young men learned to kill before they learned to love. This is Sparta, that legendary city-state where warriors were forged like bronze weapons, heated, hammered, shaped by forces that would break lesser souls. The Helots, Sparta's slave population, outnumbered their masters by perhaps 10 to 1, maybe more. They worked the fields, tended the olive groves, built the houses, cooked the food, performed all the labor that allowed Spartan citizens to spend their lives training for war. But they were more than slaves. They were a constant threat, a sleeping army within Sparta's borders, a reminder that even the mightiest warriors could be overwhelmed by sheer numbers if those numbers ever organized, ever united, ever decided that death was preferable to bondage. The Spartans, practical as always, devised a solution that was both military training and population control, both religious ritual and state-sanctioned murder. They called it the Krypteia, the secret thing, the hidden practice that every Spartan youth would experience, that would transform boys into men, into killers, into the emotionless weapons that Sparta required. Picture a young Spartan, perhaps 18 years old, his body already scarred from years of brutal training, his muscles hardened by exercises that would cripple ordinary men, his mind shaped by constant exposure to violence and pain. He has learned to endure hunger, cold, exhaustion, fear, all the weaknesses that flesh is heir to. But now comes the final test, the ultimate proof that he has transcended ordinary human limitations. In the darkness before dawn, while the city sleeps, while even the roosters have not yet begun to crow, these young men slip away from their barracks, from their beds of straw and rough wool, into the Laconian countryside. They carry only a knife, a single bronze blade, sharp enough to cut leather, strong enough to penetrate bone, small enough to conceal, to move silently through shadows. For the next year, they will live like wolves, sleeping in caves, drinking from streams, eating what they can hunt or steal. But their primary prey is not deer or wild boar, not fish from mountain streams or birds from the sky. Their quarry walks on two legs, works in fields, speaks their language, shares their blood. The Helots, the slave population that keeps Sparta functioning, have been declared fair game, open season, legitimate targets in this most intimate form of warfare. The young Spartans learn to move like ghosts, to travel by night, to read the landscape like a scroll, to understand wind direction and moon phases, to predict where Helots will be working alone, vulnerable, unprotected by numbers or witnesses. They develop the patience of hunters, the ability to wait motionless for hours, to strike only when success is certain, to kill quickly and silently, and then fade back into the wilderness like morning mist. A Helot working alone in an olive grove, reaching up to examine the fruit, checking for the proper ripeness that will make good oil, might hear nothing, sense nothing, until the bronze blade finds the space between his ribs, until his life flows away into the rich Spartan earth, until he becomes just another casualty in an undeclared war that has lasted for generations. Or a woman, carrying water from a well, her amphora balanced carefully on her shoulder, thinking perhaps of her children waiting at home, of the evening meal she needs to prepare, of small domestic concerns that make life bearable even in bondage, might simply disappear, her body hidden in a ravine, her water jar found broken beside the path, no witnesses, no explanations, just another Helot who failed to return home. The psychological impact was perhaps more important than the deaths themselves. Helots lived in constant fear, never knowing when the shadows might contain a young Spartan with a blade, never certain that any day might not be their last, never able to trust the darkness, to feel safe alone, to assume that their master's children saw them as anything more than practiced targets, training dummies that bled real blood. The young Spartans, meanwhile, learned lessons that no gymnasium could teach, no wrestling match could provide. They learned that killing was not dramatic, not heroic, not the stuff of epic poetry. It was simply a skill, like playing the lyre or calculating the phases of the moon. Something that became easier with practice, something that stopped disturbing their sleep, something that transformed them from boys who might hesitate, might show mercy, might remember that their victims were human, into men who could kill without thought, without remorse, without any emotion stronger than the satisfaction of a job well done. When they returned to the city after their year in the wilderness, they were different. Their eyes had changed, grown colder, more distant, like looking into wells that reflected no light. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had become something that was no longer entirely human, no longer capable of the simple emotions that made ordinary people vulnerable, predictable, weak. Some modern historians argue that the Crypteia was not as systematic as ancient sources suggest, that the killings were more random, more opportunistic, but the Helots knew better. They lived with the reality, felt the fear, counted their missing, understood that Spartan boys were learning to see them as wolves see sheep, as predators see prey, as one species sees another that exists only to serve their needs. The Spartans themselves seemed to understand the moral cost of this system. They performed ritual purifications before and after the Crypteia, acknowledging that blood had been shed, that pollution had been incurred, that the gods required appeasement, for what had been done in darkness, but they also understood that Sparta's survival depended on this harsh calculus, that a warrior society could not afford the luxury of mercy, could not permit their future soldiers the weakness of seeing enemies as human. These young killers, when they finally took their place among Sparta's citizen warriors, could face Persian armies without flinching, could hold the pass at Thermopylae against impossible odds, could die standing up rather than yield a single step to foreign invaders. The price of this courage, paid in Helot blood, seemed reasonable to them, necessary, even noble in its own terrible way. But late at night, in the quiet hours when even warriors must sleep, did they dream of faces? Did they remember voices pleading for mercy? Did they wonder what children had waited for parents who would never come home, what families had been broken, what lives had been ended to create the iron discipline that made Sparta strong? The Spartans, if they recorded such doubts, have not shared them with history. Their silence on such matters is itself a kind of answer, a testament to how completely the Krypteia achieved its purpose, transforming human beings into something else. Something harder, something necessary for their vision of what a warrior society required. Let your own thoughts drift away from such darkness, like clouds moving across the night sky, like the natural rhythm of breathing that continues even in sleep. These ancient cruelties, these calculated brutalities, are finished now, their echoes fading into the vast silence of historical time. Though not originally Greek, the device known as the Heretic's Fork found its way into Greek-speaking territories through the complex networks of trade, conquest, and cultural exchange that connected the ancient world. In later periods, when Christianity had spread throughout the former territories of classical Greece, when Byzantine emperors ruled from Constantinople, new forms of religious punishment emerged, blending ancient techniques with modern theological concerns. Picture, if you will, a marketplace in late antique Athens, centuries after the Golden Age, centuries after Socrates drank his hemlock, after the Parthenon had been converted from a temple to Athena into a Christian church. The old gods were gone, their statues broken or repurposed, their festivals forgotten or transformed. In their place, a new faith demanded absolute orthodoxy, complete submission to theological truths that brooked no disagreement, no questioning, no deviation. The Heretic's Fork was a simple device, almost elegant in its minimalism, two metal prongs joined by a leather strap, designed to be worn around the neck like jewelry, like the gold chains that wealthy citizens favored, but with points that pressed into the soft flesh beneath the chin and at the base of the throat. Engraved on the metal, often in Latin though sometimes in Greek, were words that spelled out the condemned person's fate: I recant, or I confess, or simply heretic. The beauty, if such a word can be applied to an instrument of torture, lay in its psychological sophistication. The wearer could not lower their head, could not look down, could not assume the humble posture that normally accompanied prayer or penitence. They were forced to keep their chin raised, their eyes fixed on heaven, their neck extended in a position that suggested pride rather than humility, defiance rather than submission. Sleep became impossible, or nearly so. Any relaxation of the neck muscles, any natural slumping that accompanies rest, would drive the lower prong deeper into the throat, would create wounds that made swallowing, breathing, speaking increasingly difficult. The condemned person learned to balance on the knife edge between consciousness and unconsciousness, between alertness and the desperate need for rest, between the desire to live and the growing realization that death might be preferable. Drinking became a challenge, a delicate negotiation between thirst and pain. Water, when it could be managed at all, often mixed with blood from the wounds that deepened with every swallow, every attempt to consume the liquid that life required. Food was generally impossible, too solid, too difficult to manage, with a throat that had become a landscape of punctures and tears. But the true genius of the Heretic's Fork was temporal. The way it stretched time, transformed hours into eternities, made each moment a separate agony that had to be endured before the next could begin. Unlike the swift justice of the sword, the sudden shock of the axe, the merciful unconsciousness that often accompanied other forms of execution, the fork demanded sustained attention, constant vigilance, unending awareness of every sensation, every breath, every heartbeat. The condemned person remained fully conscious throughout their ordeal, able to think, to remember, to anticipate, to hope and despair in endless cycles. They could see their family members pleading for mercy, could hear the prayers being offered for their soul, could observe the faces of neighbors and friends who had gathered to witness their fate. But they could not respond, could not speak clearly, could not lower their head in acknowledgement or gratitude or farewell. Sometimes the psychological pressure would break them before the physical wounds proved fatal. The combination of exhaustion, pain, and the inability to assume any comfortable position would drive some to madness, to confession of crimes they had not committed, to recantation of beliefs they still held dear, to any words that might convince their tormentors to remove the device, to grant the mercy of a quicker death. Others, perhaps more fortunate, would maintain their composure longer, would find ways to transcend the immediate physical discomfort, would discover reserves of spiritual strength that allowed them to transform their suffering into something approaching martyrdom. These were the ones who worried their executioners, who suggested that the human spirit might be more resilient than the devices designed to break it, who raised uncomfortable questions about the efficacy of forced conversion. The crowd that gathered to witness such executions, citizens of Constantinople or Thessalonica or any of the other Greek-speaking cities where such devices were employed, would observe in silence, their faces reflecting the complex emotions that public torture always evoked. Horror, certainly, but also fascination, relief that they were not the ones wearing the fork, gratitude for their own orthodox beliefs, and perhaps, buried deep beneath conscious thought, a troubled awareness that the line between orthodoxy and heresy was thinner than they liked to admit. Children, brought by parents who believed that witnessing such events would strengthen their faith, would teach them the importance of theological correctness, would show them the consequences of straying from approved doctrine, would watch with wide eyes, learning lessons that no church service could provide, understanding that belief was not merely personal, not simply a matter of private conscience, but something that could determine whether they lived or died, whether they were embraced by their community or destroyed by it. As the hours passed, as the condemned person weakened, as blood loss and exhaustion took their inevitable toll, the crowd would gradually disperse, would return to their homes and shops and daily concerns, leaving behind only the most dedicated witnesses, the most committed spectators, those who felt obligated to remain until the end, to ensure that justice, or what passed for justice, was fully served. The final moments when they came were often anticlimactic. No dramatic speeches, no last-minute revelations, no sudden interventions by divine providence or human mercy. Just a gradual slowing of breath, a peaceful closing of eyes that had been forced to stare at heaven for so many hours, a final relaxation of muscles that had fought so long against the twin prongs that had become the center of their universe. And then silence, the kind of deep, profound silence that follows the end of great suffering, the silence that allows surviving witnesses to contemplate what they have seen, to consider what it means, to wonder whether the God they worship approves of the methods used in his name, whether the faith they have preserved is worth the price that has been paid for its purity. Breathe deeply now, let these dark images fade like candle flames guttering in the wind, like memories of nightmares that lose their power in daylight. These stories, though disturbing, are finished, their lessons learned, their warnings heard, their victims finally, eternally at rest. In the windswept hills above ancient Greek cities, where olive trees grew twisted by salt breezes, where wild thyme filled the air with its sharp sweetness, where rocky outcrops provided natural altars for gods both kind and cruel. Exposure offered a method of execution that required no specialized equipment, no elaborate preparation, no particular skill beyond the ability to walk away. Picture a rocky hilltop overlooking the Aegean, where merchant ships appeared and disappeared like white birds against the blue horizon, where the wind never stopped blowing, where the sun beat down mercilessly during the day, and where stars emerged at night like cold eyes watching from an infinite darkness. Here, with no shelter, no shade, no protection from the elements, the human body would begin its slow surrender to forces larger than itself. The first enemy would be the sun, that same Helios whose chariot crossed the sky each day, bringing light and warmth to the civilized world below, but here becoming an instrument of torment. Without clothing, without shelter, the skin would redden, blister, begin to crack and peel like old parchment left too long in direct light. The lips would split, the tongue would swell, the eyes would burn and tear until vision became clouded, unreliable, increasingly dim. Thirst would arrive as a constant companion, growing stronger with each hour, each day, until it became the center of all thought, all consciousness, all remaining hope. The condemned person would dream of water, of cool springs bubbling from mountain rocks, of wine mixed with honey, of the simple clay cups that common people used for drinking, cups that now seemed like treasures beyond imagining. At night, when the sun finally released its grip on the hilltop, cold would take its place, seeping into bones that had been baked all day, into muscles that had no strength left to shiver, into a body that had already begun the slow process of shutting down, of conserving what little energy remained, of preparing for the long journey that lay ahead. Wild animals, drawn by the scent of helplessness, would circle at a respectful distance, understanding somehow that this creature posed no threat, represented nothing more than an opportunity, a meal that would eventually become available. Wolves, lean and patient, would settle down to wait, their yellow eyes reflecting starlight, their breathing visible in the cold air, their natural understanding of death far more accurate than human hopes for rescue or reprieve. Birds would be bolder, less patient, more opportunistic. Ravens, those black-winged messengers of doom that appeared in so many Greek stories, would perch nearby, cocking their heads, studying the situation with the professional interest of undertakers, calculating how much longer they would need to wait, which parts would be most accessible first, which would provide the richest rewards for their patience. Delirium would come in waves, bringing visions that seemed more real than the rocky hilltop, more immediate than the ropes that bound wrists and ankles, more compelling than the growing weakness that made each breath an effort, each heartbeat a small victory over the gravity that pulled consciousness down into darkness. The condemned might see their childhood, their mother's face, warm kitchens filled with the scent of baking bread, festivals where wine flowed freely and everyone danced until dawn, memories that had been buried under years of adult concerns, but that now surfaced like treasures from a sunken ship, bright, precious, heartbreakingly beautiful. Or they might see gods, the familiar deities of their youth, Athena with her owl perched on her shoulder, Apollo with his golden lyre, Demeter carrying sheaves of wheat, all the divine figures who had once seemed so distant, so removed from human suffering, but who now appeared close enough to touch, close enough to plead with, close enough to bargain with for just a few more hours, a few more breaths, a few more moments of consciousness. Some spoke aloud during these final days, carrying on conversations with people who were not there, explaining themselves, justifying their actions, asking forgiveness, offering forgiveness, conducting all the unfinished business of a lifetime in desperate compressed monologues that the wind carried away like smoke, like prayers, like the final words of someone who would never speak again. The body, meanwhile, continued its systematic shutdown, its orderly retreat from life. The heart would slow, struggling to pump blood that had grown thick, sluggish, inadequate to the tasks that circulation required. The kidneys would fail, no longer able to process the toxins that accumulated in blood and tissue, no longer capable of maintaining the delicate chemical balances that consciousness required. Breathing would become labored, shallow, intermittent, like waves on a beach where the tide was going out. Each breath smaller than the last, each pause between breaths longer, until finally the spaces between became longer than the breaths themselves, until silence replaced the sound of air moving in and out of lungs that could no longer sustain the rhythm of life. Death, when it finally came, would arrive not as a sudden event, but as a gradual transition, a gentle fading from one state to another, from consciousness to unconsciousness, from struggle to rest, from the hilltop where suffering had been so intense to whatever realm awaited beyond the reach of sun and wind and the patient watching of carrion birds. The Greeks who ordered such executions understood that exposure was both merciful and cruel. Merciful because it allowed for the possibility of divine intervention, of last-minute rescue, of changes of heart that might lead to reprieve, but cruel because it prolonged the process, stretched death over days instead of moments, forced the condemned person to participate fully in their own ending, to remain conscious and aware throughout most of their final journey. Weather could make the process faster or slower, more or less agonizing. A sudden storm might provide blessed water, enough to extend life for another day or two, or it might bring winds cold enough to freeze exposed flesh, to transform the hilltop into something resembling the far reaches of Hades, where the shades of the dead wandered in eternal cold and darkness. A heat wave might accelerate dehydration, might bring death more quickly, almost as a mercy, or it might create conditions so extreme that consciousness fled early, allowing the condemned person to spend their final hours in merciful unconsciousness, unaware of the sun that continued to bake their unprotected flesh, of the birds that had begun to gather more closely, of the natural processes that were already beginning to reclaim the elements that had temporarily been organized into a human life. Some families, defying law and custom, would attempt rescue missions, would climb the hills under cover of darkness, hoping to find their loved ones still alive, still capable of recognizing familiar faces, still able to accept water, food, the basic comfort of human presence during their final hours. These mercy missions rarely succeeded, but they provided comfort to the rescuers, proof that love could overcome fear, that human connections could transcend legal prohibitions, that even in the face of state-sanctioned death, individual compassion could assert itself, could declare that some bonds were stronger than law, stronger than the fear of punishment, stronger than the social pressures that normally kept people from defying authority. Other families, more practical, more resigned, would wait until the inevitable end had come, then climb the hills to retrieve what remained, to provide proper burial, to ensure that their loved one received the funeral rites that Greek religion required. The ceremonies that would ease the transition from this world to whatever lay beyond. The prayers and offerings that would help the deceased find their way to their proper place among the shades of the dead. The hilltops themselves, after serving as execution sites, would often become places of memory, locations where people would come to think about mortality, about justice, about the price that civilization sometimes demanded from individuals who transgressed against its rules. Wildflowers, growing from soil enriched by what had happened there, seemed to some observers to bloom more brightly, more beautifully, as if death itself had somehow contributed to the natural cycle, had become part of the eternal rhythm that governed all life, all growth, all the patient work of time and weather, and the countless small creatures that transformed endings into beginnings. Rest now in the knowledge that such ancient cruelties have passed, that the hilltops where they occurred now know only the peaceful sounds of wind and birdsong, that the sun, which once tortured, now only warms, that the very elements, which once served as instruments of execution, now provide the gentle backdrop for your own rest, your own peaceful drift towards sleep. Though the elaborate mechanical tortures described by later writers like Edgar Allan Poe belonged to different centuries, different cultures, the ancient Greeks were not unfamiliar with the concept of psychological torture, of death that was designed to break the mind before it claimed the body, of executions that were as much performance as punishment, as much theater as justice. In certain Greek cities, particularly those influenced by Eastern customs, by Persian ideas about the proper relationship between ruler and subject, between authority and the individual, death sentences sometimes involved elaborate mechanical devices, carefully constructed scenarios that would maximize both suffering and spectacle, that would demonstrate the technical sophistication, the creative intelligence, the almost artistic sensibility of those who wielded absolute power. Consider a deep pit, perhaps 20 feet across, 30 feet deep, carved into solid rock. Its walls smooth as glass, impossible to climb, designed to hold but never to release. At the bottom, soft sand, deep enough to cushion a fall, shallow enough to provide no comfort, fine enough to shift and move with every gesture, every attempt to find a secure place to rest, every effort to create some small area of stability in a world that had become entirely uncertain. The condemned person, lowered by rope into this stone prison, would find themselves in a space that was neither entirely dark nor adequately lit, where shadows played tricks on perception, where depth and distance became matters of guesswork rather than certainty, where the eye could never quite adjust, could never quite make sense of the visual information it received. Above, barely visible in the dim light that filtered down from the surface, a pendulum would begin its slow, hypnotic, perfectly regular swing. Not the crude axe blade that cruder civilizations might employ, but a work of art. A bronze masterpiece shaped like a crescent moon, polished to mirror brightness, sharp enough to split silk, heavy enough to cut through bone, beautiful enough to grace a temple, terrible enough to haunt dreams. The mathematics of the mechanism were precise, calculated with the same careful attention that Greek engineers brought to their catapults, their siege engines, their elaborate theatrical devices that made gods appear and disappear on stage, that created thunder, lightning, all the special effects that drama required. Each swing of the pendulum would carry it slightly lower. Each arc would bring the cutting edge fractionally closer to the sand, to the space where the condemned person waited, watched, calculated, despaired. Hours would pass, perhaps days, while the pendulum pursued its relentless schedule, its gradual descent, its patient approach to the moment when bronze would meet flesh, when the careful calculations of the engineers would finally achieve their intended result. During this time, the condemned person would experience every possible emotion, every conceivable response to approaching death, every variation of fear, hope, despair, acceptance, rage, pleading, prayer, and final resignation that the human mind could produce. Sleep would be impossible, not merely because of fear, though fear was certainly present, but because of the hypnotic effect of the pendulum itself. The way it drew the eye, commanded attention, became the center of all consciousness, all awareness, all thought. The rhythmic motion, perfectly regular as a heartbeat, as breathing, as the passage of time itself, would gradually synchronize with the observer's own biological rhythms, would become part of their internal world, part of their deepest sense of order and continuity. The sound was perhaps worse than the sight, the whisper of bronze cutting through air, the soft hiss of metal moving at speeds that would soon prove fatal, the almost musical quality of the pendulum's song, a lullaby that promised not sleep, but death, not rest, but the final cessation of all rhythm, all motion, all the small sounds that life produces simply by continuing to exist. Water would be lowered occasionally, enough to prevent death by thirst, enough to maintain consciousness, enough to ensure that the condemned person experienced every moment of their ordeal, every swing of the pendulum, every fractional decrease in the distance between cutting edge and flesh, every growing certainty that time was running out, that rescue would not come, that this elaborate machine would complete its appointed task, regardless of pleading, prayer, or any human intervention. Food might also be provided, simple fare, bread, perhaps some fruit, just enough nutrition to maintain strength, to prevent the weakness that might grant early unconsciousness, early escape from full awareness of what was approaching. The condemned person would eat mechanically, without pleasure, understanding that they were participating in their own torture, that every bite extended their suffering, but unable to resist the basic biological drives that made starvation seem worse than the gradual approach of the bronze crescent above. Madness, when it came, often took the form of detailed calculations, obsessive measurements of the pendulum's position, careful timing of its swing, elaborate mathematical projections about exactly when the blade would reach its target, exactly how many more hours or minutes remained, exactly what angle the cut would take, exactly how much pain would be involved, exactly how long consciousness would survive the first contact between bronze and bone. Some condemned prisoners would attempt to move, to shift position, to somehow avoid the path that the pendulum was tracing. But the pit was designed to prevent such evasions. Its dimensions carefully calculated to ensure that no matter where the victim positioned themselves, no matter how they tried to curl up, to compress themselves, to minimize their target area, the blade would find them when its time came, would complete its appointed task with the precision that Greek engineering could provide. Others would attempt to damage the mechanism, to interfere with the pendulum's motion, to throw sand or stones, to somehow disrupt the mathematical perfection that governed their fate. But the device was positioned too high, suspended too far above, protected by the very pit that imprisoned them, unreachable, untouchable, as remote and indifferent as the gods themselves, as inevitable as the passage of seasons, as certain as the rising and setting of the sun. The final hours, when the pendulum had descended far enough that its blade began to disturb the sand with each pass, began to trace visible marks in the fine grains, began to create the geometric patterns that would soon be traced in flesh. These hours brought a strange kind of peace, the peace that comes with absolute certainty, with the end of hope, with the final acceptance that struggle is useless, that death has been scheduled, that human will and divine providence have both proven inadequate to change what careful engineering has set in motion. The last swing, when it came, would be swift, almost anticlimactic after so many hours of anticipation, so much careful observation, so much detailed calculation of angles and timing, and the physics of falling blades. One moment, consciousness, awareness, the continuing rhythm of heartbeat and breathing and all the small biological processes that defined life. The next moment, silence, stillness, the eternal rest that the pendulum had promised, had delivered, had provided with the precision that only Greek craftsmanship could achieve. The pit would then become a tomb. The pendulum would be reset for its next victim, and the engineers would make notes. Small adjustments, minor improvements to the timing, the angle, the mathematical relationships that governed the machine's operation. Death, in their hands, had become a science, a technology, an art form that could be refined, perfected, elevated to levels of sophistication that would make the gods themselves pause in admiration, or perhaps in horror at what mortal ingenuity could accomplish when freed from the constraints of mercy. Let these mechanical nightmares fade now, like the memory of complex dreams that dissolve in morning light, like echoes of ancient fears that have no power over the present moment, like shadows cast by objects that no longer exist, by civilizations that have crumbled into dust, by cruelties that time itself has rendered harmless, impotent, nothing more than stories told to help the living appreciate the peace, the safety, the simple blessing of falling asleep in their own beds, in their own time, surrounded by gentleness rather than bronze, by love rather than mathematics, by the natural rhythm of rest rather than the calculated precision of instruments designed to end rather than preserve, to destroy rather than create, to bring silence rather than the continuing music of breath and heartbeat, and all the small sounds that life makes simply by persisting, by continuing, by refusing to surrender to the darkness that waits, patient and still. At the end of every story, every life, every gentle drift toward the sleep that comes naturally, peacefully, without mechanical assistance, without bronze crescents, without anything more elaborate than the simple blessing of tired eyes closing, of breathing slowing, of consciousness fading like candlelight in a gentle breeze. Deep beneath the palace of Knossos in Crete, where the Minoan civilization once flourished, where bulls danced through frescoed halls, where the scent of saffron and olive oil mingled with sea breezes from the harbor, King Minos commissioned a construction that would become legendary, not for its beauty, but for its purpose, its design, its intended function as the ultimate prison, the perfect trap, a place where death would come not through violence, but through the slow erosion of hope, the gradual dissolution of reason, the gentle madness that overtakes those who wander too long in corridors that lead nowhere, that circle back upon themselves, that offer the illusion of progress while delivering only repetition, confusion, despair. The labyrinth, designed by Daedalus, that master craftsman whose name became synonymous with ingenuity, with technical brilliance, with the ability to solve problems that seemed impossible, was not merely a maze. Common mazes, garden puzzles, temporary diversions, these could be solved by patience, by systematic exploration, by the simple expedient of keeping one hand always touching the wall, following it until exit or entrance was reached. But the labyrinth was something more sophisticated, more psychologically astute, more precisely calibrated to break the human spirit through means more subtle than bars, more effective than chains. Picture corridors that seemed familiar, but were not quite the same as the ones encountered an hour before, passages that appeared to lead upward, but somehow brought the wanderer back to a level below where they had started. Intersections that offered four choices, each equally promising, each ultimately disappointing, each leading to new complications rather than resolution, new questions rather than answers, new problems rather than the solution that always seemed just one more turn away. The walls were not blank stone, not featureless surfaces that would quickly exhaust visual interest. Instead, they were covered with frescoes, murals, artwork that demanded attention, that rewarded careful study, that created the illusion of progress, even when forward motion had ceased. A wanderer might spend an hour examining the painted dolphins that seemed to leap from wall to wall, might trace the story of Theseus and the Minotaur through a series of connected images, might puzzle over hieroglyphs that seemed meaningful, important, relevant to escape, but which actually provided no useful information, no clues, no assistance beyond the temporary distraction they offered from the growing realization that no progress was being made, that no exit was being approached, that the labyrinth was winning. Sound within the maze was carefully controlled, engineered with the same precision that governed its visual elements. Footsteps echoed strangely, sometimes seeming to come from ahead, sometimes from behind, creating the impression that other wanderers were nearby, that rescue might be approaching, that solitude was about to end. But when voices called out, when desperate shouts sought response, the echoes that came back were distorted, delayed, transformed by the acoustics into something unrecognizable, something that might have been human speech, or might have been wind, water, the settling of stones, the imagination of someone whose isolation had begun to affect their perception, their judgment, their ability to distinguish between real and imagined sounds. Water was provided, but not consistently, not predictably. Sometimes a fountain would offer sweet, clear, refreshing liquid that seemed like divine gift, like proof that the gods had not entirely abandoned their victim, like encouragement to continue the search, to maintain hope, to keep walking despite the evidence that walking led nowhere. At other times, the same fountain would be dry, empty, offering only the mockery of carved stone nymphs whose mouths no longer flowed, whose promise of refreshment had been withdrawn, whose silence suggested that even the water had lost faith in the possibility of escape. Food was similarly intermittent, similarly unpredictable. Corridors might reveal alcoves stocked with bread, cheese, wine, olives, all the staples of civilized life, all the comforts that made existence pleasant rather than merely possible. But these discoveries came randomly, without pattern, without any logic that the wanderer could discern, creating a foraging lifestyle that focused attention on immediate survival rather than long-term planning, that made strategic thinking impossible, that reduced complex human beings to their most basic biological functions: hunger, thirst, the need for shelter, the animal-level responses that remained when higher reasoning had been systematically frustrated, undermined, finally abandoned. Time within the labyrinth became elastic, unreliable, meaningless, without sun or stars, without the natural rhythms that normally governed human schedules, without any external reference points that might provide orientation. Days and nights blended together, became indistinguishable, merged into a continuous present tense that had no relationship to past or future, no connection to the outside world, no relevance to any existence beyond these corridors, these walls, these endlessly repeating patterns that had become the entire universe, the complete reality, the only context within which thought, emotion, hope, despair had any meaning. Sleep, when exhaustion finally made it unavoidable, came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that were often indistinguishable from waking experience, by nightmares that seemed no worse than the reality of continuing to search for an exit that might not exist, by moments of seeming wakefulness that might themselves have been dreams, fantasies, the productions of a mind that could no longer reliably distinguish between perception and imagination, between memory and invention, between the corridors that actually existed and the corridors that hope, desperation, madness had created. Some wanderers, those who maintained their sanity longest, who resisted most effectively the psychological pressure that the labyrinth applied, would attempt to mark their passage, to leave signs, to create maps, to impose some kind of rational order on the chaos that surrounded them. They would scratch marks on walls, arrange stones in patterns, create cairns that might serve as landmarks, as reference points, as proof that progress was being made, that the maze could be conquered through systematic application of human intelligence, human persistence, human refusal to surrender to architectural determinism. But the labyrinth, designed by Daedalus, created by the same mind that would later craft wings to carry him and his son across the wine-dark sea, had anticipated such strategies. The marks would disappear, somehow, mysteriously, perhaps removed by maintenance crews, perhaps eroded by moisture that seeped through stones, perhaps dissolved by some chemical process that left walls clean, unmarked, ready for the next desperate attempt to impose order on designed chaos. The stones would be scattered, the cairns demolished, the carefully constructed maps reduced to meaningless piles of rubble that provided no information, no guidance, no assistance beyond the growing certainty that the maze itself was actively hostile, actively working to prevent escape, actively engaged in the systematic destruction of human hope, human reason, human confidence in the ability to solve problems through intelligence, persistence, the application of logical principles to apparently logical challenges. Madness, when it finally came, often took the form of conversation. Elaborate discussions with companions who were not there, with gods who did not answer, with the walls themselves, which became confidants, advisors, friends, enemies, lovers, parents, children, all the human relationships that isolation had made impossible, that the labyrinth had stolen, that memory now provided as substitutes for the social connections that make sanity possible, that make existence bearable, that remind human beings that they are not alone in the universe, not forgotten, not abandoned to architectural nightmares that have no purpose beyond entertainment, beyond the satisfaction that comes from watching intelligence struggle against superior design, watching hope slowly erode under the pressure of repetition, frustration, the growing certainty that some problems have no solutions, that some prisons have no exits, that some stories have no happy endings. The final stage, for those who survived long enough to reach it, was often a kind of peace. The peace that comes with complete surrender, with the end of struggle, with acceptance that the labyrinth had won, that escape was impossible, that the corridors had become home, that the search could finally end, not in victory, but in the recognition that victory had never been possible, that the game had been rigged from the beginning, that Daedalus, master craftsman, brilliant engineer, creator of wings and labyrinths and all manner of impossible devices, had created something that transcended mere architecture, that had become a perfect metaphor for the human condition, for the way that life itself often seems like a maze without exit, a puzzle without solution, a story without ending, except for the gentle drift toward sleep, toward rest, toward the final corridor that leads not to another intersection, another choice, another disappointment, but to silence, stillness, the end of wandering, the end of searching, the end of hoping, the beginning of rest. Let your own wandering mind find its way now to gentler corridors, to passages that lead toward rest rather than confusion, toward sleep rather than endless searching, toward the simple peace that comes not from solving impossible puzzles, but from accepting that some questions need no answers, that some paths need no destinations, that some journeys end not in arrival, but in the quiet recognition that the walking itself, the searching itself, the hoping itself were enough, were valuable, were worthy, were human, and that humanity, even in the face of impossible architecture, even surrounded by walls that lead nowhere, even lost in mazes designed by master craftsmen, still retains the capacity for peace, for rest, for the gentle surrender that comes not from defeat, but from wisdom, from the understanding that not all problems require solutions, that not all mazes require escape, that not all stories require happy endings. Only the quiet satisfaction that comes from having walked, having searched, having hoped, having been human in the face of inhuman challenges, having maintained dignity even in the corridors of despair, having found peace even in the heart of the labyrinth. And so we close our journey through these ancient methods of death, these distant cruelties that time has transformed from terrifying realities into gentle stories that help us appreciate the peace we now possess. The hemlock has lost its poison, the bronze bull has cooled forever, the boats of Scaphism have rotted away, the Spartan youths have put down their knives, the heretic's fork has been melted down and reformed into something beautiful. The hills of exposure now host only wildflowers. The pendulums have stopped their swinging, and the labyrinth has become nothing more than a metaphor for the gentle confusion that precedes sleep. Rest now, knowing that these ancient struggles are finished, that their lessons have been learned, that their warnings have been heard, and that the only thing that remains is the soft rhythm of your own breathing, the peaceful beating of your own heart, the gentle drift toward dreams that are kinder than history, sweeter than memory, more peaceful than any story ever told about the ways that ancient peoples found their final rest. Sleep well, gentle listener. Sleep well.